Well, I'm going to be focusing solely on climate change, though I think Kate's points about the wider set of resources obviously are very important indeed. So I'm going to be looking at economic growth and climate change, our Paris commitments, and actually focusing in on Sweden, but also very similarly the UK, where I spent quite a lot of my time as well. And I called it beyond nebulous arm waving, because actually I think that's what most people do on climate change. They just talk about things and, oh, this will be wonderful, that will work, but no one actually goes back and looks at the detail involved.
I think they want you to put it
a bit closer.
Yeah. Is that better?
Is that better? Oh, okay. Oh dear. I feel like I should be singing now. So the outline of my talk here is I want to lay out what are the Paris commitments for the Paris Agreement, and what is our starting position. We have to be honest about where we are today, and I think virtually, well, certainly in a political sense we're not, and actually I think most of the times people who work on climate change are not even honest about where we're starting from. Then look at what rates of mitigation, what rates of reducing emissions we have to deliver on our Paris commitments. Then ask, can we still deliver those rates? Is it possible? And then are they compatible with economic growth? So there's a sort of sequence of logic through that. And in the end, I think quite an important question, does it matter? So the Paris Agreement establishes very clear commitments for all the signatories, which includes, of course, Sweden. To hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and to pursue efforts to keep it below 1.5. To do so in accordance with the best science, but also on the basis of equity. And no country in the world, the rich country in the world, takes any notice, serious notice of the equity component, including the latest climate change law in Sweden or the similar Climate Change Act in the UK. And let's also be clear, at 2 degrees centigrade, that is not a safe threshold. At 2 degrees centigrade, this is a global average. Many people will die, they'll be poor, they'll be low emitters, they'll generally live in the southern hemisphere, and then generally be non-white. So we know that we are actually likely to be causing these problems elsewhere in the world if we keep on emitting like we are today. So to respond to this challenge, we have to really be honest about where are we today. The first IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their first report came out in 1990. Now, when I'm often talking to students, I can say that's before they're born. One or two of you here were clearly born before 1990, unlike myself. So the first report was 1990. And yet in 2016, carbon dioxide emissions were 60% higher than they were at the time of the first report. 60% higher after 26 years of knowing about climate change sufficiently to act. In 2017, they went up by about 2%. So they are still rising. We're not even yet stabilising emissions over a quarter of a century since the first report came out. And despite the optimistic rhetoric, there's no sense of us going to be bringing the emissions down in the near term at the moment. There is no intention, the World Economic Forum, they're not intending to bring emissions down at all in the near term. I'll come back to them later. And why have we failed? If we've failed because we've had this shameful litany of scams and delusion, and that's me being quite polite about what I think about these things. We've had offsetting, where the rich have tried to pay someone else to diet for us as we fly off to somewhere else in the world. We have the clean development mechanism, which starts to look, sound quite worthwhile and formal, but it's just basically state-sanctioned offsetting. So you can claim to, you can build a new airport or expand an airport and then pay someone in Ghana or pay some people in Ghana to reduce their emissions for you. Also fraudulent. We've got the emissions trading scheme, which sounds quite good, except for then you realise there are so many emission permits that the price of carbon has remained almost zero, or at least very low indeed. We've got afforestation, plant a tree, grow an airport. And we're now relying on future negative emission technologies that do not yet exist at huge planetary scale to solve the problem for us. And when that one chooses to fail as well, we'll have geoengineering. We'll be injecting sulfate particles into the stratosphere to reflect the sunlight back out into space. That's why we've had 27 years of failure. We've not actually tried mitigation. We have not tried to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions yet. And even in Sweden, I would slightly disagree with Kate on this. If you include aviation and shipping emissions, imports and exports, even the UK and Sweden, two of the leading countries on climate change, have seen virtually no reduction in their emissions since 1990. So two of the most progressive countries on climate change have not seen any reduction since 1990. So we have failed abysmally here. My interpretation from working inside the climate community is that in developing our emission scenarios, the sorts of things that the Davos people will have been looking at, we have deliberately applied questionable assumptions and fine-tuned our analysis to align with political and economic sensibilities that academics like me, the NGOs, the charities and so forth, and a lot of the policymakers, we've been co-opted by near-term power. We want to be at the table. We want to be at Davos. And therefore, we have to say things they want to hear. We dare not question the neoliberal model, whatever you want to call it, socio-economic paradigm, the concept of economic growth. We must not question that. So I often point out, we've had 13 billion years of physics. Yet we've only had about a few decades of the ephemeral economic model. And yet, as academics, we're prepared to forego 13 billion years of physics to satisfy a few years of economics. So let's try and frame this issue to take it away from being nebulous, to say something about, well, what do we need to do in terms of rates of change? I've taken away a lot of the maths here, so you have to sort of take my word for this. It comes out of the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change reports, and some basic arithmetic. So we've committed to stay an unlikely chance of 1.5 or a likely chance of 2, and if you plot that out, it looks something like this, very, very demanding curves. And what's really important is the area under the curve. So everything that we emit today in carbon dioxide will be there changing the climate for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So whenever we emit carbon dioxide, we are locking the future into a changed climate. So you then start to say, well, what are the reduction rates we need here? The red line being for 1.5 and the blue line for 2 degrees centigrade. Well, those reduction rates, I'm assuming here, are increasing. So we start now and we start to increase the rate we reduce our emissions every year. And they eventually reach about 20% per annum in about 2 decades from now for 1.5. 20% reduction every single year. So they're getting tighter and tighter up till then. And for 2 degrees centigrade, about 11% by the mid-2020s. 2030s rather. But remember, this is a global picture. And what matters here, and this number, just take a note of this number, is the total amount of carbon dioxide we can put in the atmosphere, the carbon budget. It's about 800 billion tons of carbon dioxide we can put into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels for 2 degrees centigrade. We put into the atmosphere at the moment about 40 billion a year. So a bit of maths tells you you've got 20 years at current levels. So I'm going to come back to the 800 billion in a minute. So it's quite an important number. Now, another part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what's called Working Group 3, is dominated by economists with some engineers and scientists, but mostly economics. And they paint a very different picture from what's called Working Group 1, if you like, the science part that we have in climate science and climate change. And their picture looks like this, which is much more attractive, of course. So now we haven't got to reduce things so fast, we've got much longer to do this. And that's about 1,600 billion tons. So remember before I said for 2 degrees centigrade we have 800 from the science, and yet these people are saying we've got 1,600. So there's some confusion there for policymakers. This provides much less mitigation rate, so it's much more appealing. We haven't got to reduce our emissions so quickly. It's a much more attractive policy narrative. And to use the sort of the Pope's language from his encyclical on climate change, it's really a utopian alliance of technology and economics. And it's this form of thinking of the world that is informing people like most of our governments and the Davos set. So for a likely chance of 2 degrees centigrade, the science is saying we've got 800 billion, and the economists are saying, very simply, the economists are saying we've got about 1,600 billion tons. And there's a very big difference between those two. So how have they achieved this? How come there's such a big difference from the official forms, official language we're hearing from the specialists? And that's because we are relying on something which some of you might have heard of, but most of you probably haven't, called negative emission technologies. Now you can't go and buy these because they don't exist. These are speculative, imaginary futures of technologies that we only have some idea in our minds about what they might look like. And these are, in all of our models, are assumed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the future. So basically, we're asking our children to come up with this technology and suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere because we cannot be bothered to make the changes today. And this dominates every single model informing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and pretty much all governments in the world, including, of course, the Swedish climate change law. What's worrying, we have to carry on doing this beyond the end of the century. And there are particular ways we're planning to do this, which we can maybe get into discussing later. But remember, these technologies do not exist, but they are embedded in all of the models already. And just to give some sort of flavour of this, at the moment we put into the atmosphere about 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. About half of that is absorbed by the oceans and by the plants, naturally absorbed. The other half just builds up year on year. These technologies that do not exist, we are expecting to absorb roughly the same amount as our current planet does today. So it's like bolting another planet alongside our own. We are relying on this to allow us to carry on using our lander and using our cars and burning fossil fuels. So we're relying on these technologies to do this some point in the future. It's a real generational passing on of responsibility. So Paris academics and politicians, many of them, rather than focus on urgent and deep mitigation today, because that has challenging political and economic repercussions, which I'll come back to in a minute, we prefer to rely on non-existent technologies to suck huge quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the future, which allow us to burn fossil fuels out to 2100 and beyond, which is embedded in most of the models, and it allows us to continue with our social norms and our economic growth dogma. So you can see why we have that approach, because it allows basically business as usual. Now, if you took away the nets, the negative emission technologies, and just used the basic science, said, well, how much can we put in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, for 2 degrees centigrade? And then if you start to say, well, how would we look at that for Sweden? What would that look like? So a headline message for Sweden, and indeed for the UK, was that if we assume the poorer parts of the world, which are dominated by China, reduce their emissions very rapidly from a peak in the early 2020s. Now that's a massive request of the poorer parts of the world, but just about viable. If Sweden and the UK are honest about trying to meet their Paris commitments, and no country in the world, including those two, are honest about that at the moment, and the policymakers want to have a scientific foundation rather than one that's based on astrology to inform their policies, then Sweden and the UK needs to start reducing its emissions by at the very least, 10% every single year, starting January the 1st of this year, so already a bit late. And really, we need to be aiming for 15% every single year. And remember, because it's a cumulative problem, every year we fail, the next year gets harder. And we should have started in 1990, but people of my generation chose to fail and pass it on to our children. And that's why we're in this position today. That's about a 75% reduction in our carbon dioxide emissions, 3/4 by about the mid-2020s, in just 7 or 8 years from now. Just think of our own lives in relation to that. And that's full decarbonisation of our energy system by about 2035 to 2040. That's planes, ships, refrigerators, cars, everything. Zero carbon, not low carbon. Low carbon is not good enough because the carbon just keeps accumulating in the atmosphere. So what are the Swedish and the UK climate change laws, which are the most progressive worldwide at the moment? Well, they have ignored equity. They have said, we want a larger slice of the carbon budget pie than is really fair, so we are prepared to impose greater problems for poorer parts of the world. That's the language that's there, that's hidden behind the report and the law. We have ignored aviation and shipping, like every country does. I don't know who takes responsibility for aviation and shipping, but no country in the world does at the moment. And in Sweden, it's a very significant percentage, probably up to about 14 to 15% of all emissions come from aviation and shipping. We are embracing non-existent speculative technologies to solve the problem for us in the future, as if they will actually work. In Sweden, we're building a liquefied natural gas terminal. The EU is having meetings just in a few days' time about building a new gas network across the whole of Europe, locking in ongoing high-carbon infrastructure for decades to come. Why on earth are the Swedes building an LNG terminal? That's a disgrace. It's also a disgrace that the UK is trying to prospect for shale gas. These are not countries that are concerned about climate change. We have a policy framework in Sweden and the UK, which, as I say, is much better than most countries, but it's much more aligned with 3 degrees C or 4 degrees C of warming in the future, not with 2 degrees C and nowhere near 1.5. So if we are to deliver on climate change, on our commitments on 2 degrees centigrade, there are 3 principal areas of action. I'm just going to touch on these very quickly. The first is on behaviours and practices by those of us who are primarily the big emitters, the high emitting people. And I think this is quite amazing that top 10% of the population emit about half of all of the world's emissions. And they can guarantee that there are all the people in Davos were definitely in that set, claiming that, what should we do about this issue? They need to get a mirror and they know what to do. If we reduce the emissions of this 10% to the level of the average European, that would be a 1/3 cut in global emissions. Just that top 10% reducing to the level of the average European. And we know who that top 10% are. They're people like me. They're people like the policymakers. Probably some of you here are in that top 10%. Probably most Swedes, a significant proportion of Sweden will be in that percentage, maybe half or maybe more. But if we started to demonstrate that, we would lead by example. Now, not everyone's going to do that, but some people could start doing that, and that would catalyse change. It allows the policymakers to have legitimacy to put in strong policies. It is our job to feed into the policy process. On top of that, there are plenty of things we can do to make things a lot more efficient, whether it's our cars or our laptops. Whenever we buy something, we should look for the most efficient that is available. And that could make a big difference to our emissions. If you put all of that together, for the OECD parts of the world, in about 10 years to 15 years, you could reduce emissions by about 40 to 70% just through behaviour and efficiency. That's not enough, but it's helpful, and very helpful. The other thing, of course, is the thing we all know about and that we always talk about and the politicians focus on, is about low-carbon energy supply, from wind turbines to nuclear power or solar panels and so forth. There are plenty of options, but they're almost all electricity. And yet electricity is just 20% of the energy we consume, or in Sweden it's only 30%. So 70% of the energy Swedes consume is not electricity. So you have to electrify the rest of the system. That's a huge task and a major sort of employment prospects for the next 2 or 3 decades. Climate change is now system change because people of my generation chose to fail. That means if we interpret Paris through the logic of carbon budgets, through the science of carbon budgets, it begs fundamental questions of our norms and of our paradigms. We require a Marshall-style transformation of our energy systems and our supply technologies and our infrastructures. That's like the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, but even more challenging than that. So we have to move very rapidly to electrified systems. We need the rapid penetration of energy-efficient technologies, not just a choice, a label, but actually standards that force that for all manufacturers. We need huge shifts in behaviour by academics, by policymakers, by business leaders, and probably by quite a few of us here to reduce our emissions. And we need to develop economic models that are fit for purpose. The one that dominates at the moment, the neoclassical market-based model, is simply not up to the job of what we're looking at. It focuses on small changes. Its theoretical foundation is on marginal changes, and yet we are looking at system-level changes. You would never use Newton mechanics to understand quantum mechanics. If there are any fluid dynamicists there, you'd never use laminar flow to understand turbulent flow. So why are we using marginal, small-scale economics to understand system-level changes? It tells us nothing about that system. And we need major reparation in helping poorer parts of the world make the transition, leapfrog us to a low-carbon infrastructure for the future. This has to start now and be completed within 3 decades. So, is economic growth compatible with 10 to 15% per year starting now? 75% reduction in the next few years? Remember, we've already failed for 5 weeks. It's September the 6th today, I think. That's right, I think. So we've had 5 weeks of failure, which means it's going to be much harder tomorrow. And my guess is we'll choose to fail tomorrow as well. But economic growth is just a misguided proxy. And why do we ever worry about it? Why do we even talk about economic growth? I don't know where this has come from. If you went back 40 years, people weren't talking about economic growth. If you went back even 30 years, very few people were. It subsumes the real social goods in our society, including, as I point out here, health, life expectancy, welfare, employment, income, job security, equity, literacy rates, safety, low crime, fun and laughter. All these things have their own metrics of measuring them. These have nothing to do with economic growth. If I ask people how much they love their children, they're not going to give me it in pounds and pence or krona, are they? It's not how we see the world. All the things that we value in the world do not have a financial number attached to them. Everything we value, that we deeply value. It makes the heterogeneous world, the rich tapestry of the world in which we live, where we have everything and all sorts of things out there, the things that we engage with, it makes it all one that can be valued into a single unit, a homogeneous unit, whether that's dollar or krona or euros or whatever it might be. That's, again, not how any of us see the world. Economic growth itself is not real and is actually, I would argue, has no meaningful value. It has been an incredibly unhelpful way to think about progress. This quote here is just taken, it's a final comment slide, taken from a paper myself and my colleague Alice Larkin published in 2012 called A New Paradigm for Climate Change. It was in Nature. And it says, leave the market economists to fight amongst themselves over the right price for carbon. Let them relive their Groundhog Day if they wish. The world is moving on, and we have to have the audacity, the courage to think differently and conceive of alternative futures, alternative low-carbon and prosperous futures. So on the upbeat note, thanks for listening.
I can only sadly say that Australia was not included in the list of doing a reasonable job. And with that, I ask you the first question, which is, what is it that Sweden, like you went through a few things, but really, maybe Sweden should take on the job of undermining other countries' emissions, especially Australian. I would love that. But what is it Sweden can do? What we, the people?
Well, I think you could get your government in the climate change law for it to have a scientific foundation, have a strong foundation on carbon budgets. It then also needs to think about the imports and exports. So it needs to do the things with its own community. So quite clear things are, I mean, Sweden is looking to build a liquefied natural gas terminal, in other words, another fossil fuel future, and expand its airports. Now, they just did not fit with Paris in any way, shape or form. So there are really clear, obvious things that need to be done. You drive around in very large, big cars called Volvos. You know, why do you need 2,000 kilograms of Volvo to transmit 90 kilograms of Swedish person? I mean, there are lots of ways we need to be thinking differently about the world, but then we also have to think about what we import and what we export. So it isn't just good enough to think about Sweden's boundaries, it needs to think beyond that. And the reason I'm putting a lot of emphasis on Sweden is not only because I'm in Sweden, and I like being here, and I do hope to come back here after 6 months. It depends on what happens with Brexit. Maybe we'll be isolated off to that little island called the UK. But I mean, Sweden has a reputation of somewhere that's socially and environmentally progressive. And on climate change, it is not living up to that at the moment. And it needs to live up to that. It can punch far, maybe that's the wrong metaphor. We have the expression in the UK, you can punch above its weight. It is a much more important country than a 10 million population suggests. And I think Sweden could be a real catalyst for change within the EU, and the EU could then be a catalyst for change more globally. So I think Sweden has some sort of moral responsibility because of its position to actually do much more than it's doing at the moment.
Ni pratar och använder ofta, tycker jag, sopa egen golv. So you talk about sweeping the floor in front of you or in front of us. I'm also a Swede, so. But Australians don't talk like that.
No, I mean, there are lots of Australians worried about climate change as well, but I mean, you've got all the worst facets of the UK, except for the weather. That's slightly better. But I think in lots of other ways, in relation to energy and your attitude towards the environment, the Australians are really very poor.